We are almost never taught the real role war has played in shaping the world we live in. Instead, most of us absorb a simplistic idea. War is a tragedy that disrupts lives, and economies just snap back once it's over. But the true relationship between war and economic evolution is far more complex and far more consequential. War has been one of the most powerful drivers of technological innovation, institutional reform, and economic transformation in modern history. The economies we take for granted today, from industrial production systems to global financial networks, were shaped not in peaceful boardrooms, but in the fires of conflict. To understand how deeply war has influenced economic structures, we need to start by recognizing a vital distinction. War doesn't just destroy, it rearranges. It destroys old norms and, in doing so, forces societies to build new ones. Sometimes those new systems become stronger, more integrated, and more productive than what existed before. But the path isn't smooth. It's painful, chaotic, and often misunderstood. Take one of the biggest economic transitions in the last half-millennium, the shift from feudal economies to market-oriented industrial powers. For centuries, Europe's economic framework was rooted in agrarian feudalism, land tied to nobility, labor bound to estates, production limited by traditional constraints. Political power was local, commerce was regional, and innovation was slow. Then came the great wars of religion, succession, and empire in the 16th and 17th centuries. These weren't just battles over territory, they were battles that dismantled old economic privileges and forced emerging states to find new ways of funding armies and governing populations.
Suddenly, monarchs needed reliable tax systems, standardized currencies, and centralized bureaucracies to support continuous military campaigns. The governments that succeeded in creating these systems, think of England under the Tudors and later the British state during the 18th century, built economic foundations that outlasted the wars themselves. They didn't just win battles, they created institutions that supported commerce, trade, and long-term investment. The enemy of feudal fragmentation became the inadvertent architect of centralized economic authority. Fast forward to the 19th century, and the pattern repeats in a new form. The Napoleonic Wars, often remembered for battlefield maneuvers and strategic brilliance, were also a tremendous economic catalyst. As Napoleon swept across Europe, he tore down feudal tariffs, abolished internal trade barriers, and introduced standardized legal codes. In doing so, he unintentionally set the stage for economic unification in regions that had long been divided by local tolls and trade restrictions. The economic integration that followed didn't begin in boardrooms. It was forged by cannons and maintained by the administrative systems Napoleon imposed. This isn't an isolated incident. The economic history of the modern world, whether in Europe, Asia, or the Americas, is littered with examples where war accelerated economic transformation that might otherwise have taken generations. The American Civil War is another powerful case. Before the conflict, the United States was largely agricultural, its industry concentrated in the North, and its economic structure tied to regional specialization. The war destroyed the old plantation economy in the South, an economy that depended on enslaved labor and resisted industrialization. But it also created a necessity for large-scale industrial production to supply armies with railroads, weapons, uniforms, and food.
The result? By the end of the war, the US had built one of the most formidable industrial bases in the world. The same production networks that supplied the Union Army became the backbone of the nation's post-war economic expansion. Railroads connected coasts, factories produced at scale, and finance adopted to fuel growth. The economy had been reshaped by conflict, not just in output, but in structure. War also forces nations to innovate technologically. The demands of conflict, speed, efficiency, communication, require better tools. Often, these innovations spill over into civilian use, transforming entire industries. The classic example is the World War II era.
It was one of the most destructive periods in human history, but it was also an era of unprecedented technological advancement. Radar systems, jet engines, nuclear energy, and coded communications were all accelerated by wartime research. The same technologies that helped win battles laid the groundwork for post-war economic expansion. But the influences were deeper than technology alone. World War II also reshaped global economic governance. The devastation of the war made it clear that economic instability and protectionism could fuel conflict. In response, leaders at the end of the war crafted new institutions aimed at stabilizing the global economy. Institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and eventually frameworks that facilitated trade. These institutions didn't emerge from a peaceful consensus. They emerged from the understanding that the economic dislocation of the 1930s, combined with the devastation of war, had created fertile ground for economic nationalism and instability. The post-war economic order was built on the lessons of conflict. But war doesn't always produce orderly transitions. Sometimes it exacerbates fragility, inequality, or dependency, especially when nations lack the capacity to build new systems in its aftermath. Look at the aftermath of the First World War. The war left European empires weakened, debt soaring, and political structures fractured. Instead of coordinated economic reform, too many nations turned inward, protected industries with tariffs, and delayed necessary modernization. The result was stagnation, and ultimately the economic conditions that helped fuel the Great Depression and another, even deadlier conflict. Wars don't automatically produce beneficial economic transformations. The outcome depends on the institutions nations build in response, the policies they adopt, and the degree to which they understand that destruction alone isn't enough. It must be paired with innovation and reform. We can see similar patterns in the post-colonial era of the mid-20th century. Many nations emerged from wars of independence with economies designed around colonial extraction. Ports, railroads, and systems were built to move raw materials to imperial centers, not to foster diversified internal growth. In regions that failed to transform these inherited structures into systems that served broader populations, economic stagnation and political instability often followed. On the other hand, nations that used the disruption of war as a chance to rethink their economic models, investing in education, infrastructure, and industrial capacity, were better positioned for growth. The lesson is clear. Conflict can tear down old systems, but without intentional economic planning, what replaces them can be fragile or extractive in new ways. It's also important to recognize how wars have influenced labor markets. The two world wars pulled millions of men out of regular employment and forced women into factories, offices, and fields. In many cases, these shifts challenged existing social norms and expanded the role of women in the workforce. After the wars, even when some women were pushed back into traditional roles, the economic impact, a larger pool of skilled labor, and broader expectations about participation endured. Labor markets were reshaped not because of policy alone, but because war disrupted assumptions about who could contribute economically. Another profound effect of war on modern economies comes from defense spending and the military-industrial complex. In the United States after World War II, defense expenditures didn't simply vanish. Instead, they became a stable part of the federal budget and a driver of industrial innovation. From aerospace to semiconductors, government defense contracts subsidized research that later became civilian technologies. This pattern repeated in other nations during the Cold War, creating industries that were funded initially by defense imperatives and later commercialized for broader economic growth. But it's not all positive. Nations that become overly dependent on military spending can distort their economies, underinvest in social infrastructure, and create cycles where economic priorities are shaped more by security than by broad prosperity. War shapes not only technology and institutions, but also the priorities of economic investment, for better and for worse. The lesson from history is that war is both destructive and transformative. It breaks old systems, but it also forces societies to build new ones. It accelerates innovation, but it can entrench imbalances if reconstruction isn't managed well. It shapes labor markets, government structures, and even global financial governance. So what does this mean for how we understand modern economies? It means we cannot separate economic evolution from the conflicts that helped drive it. The institutions that stabilize markets, the technologies that power growth, the labor structures that support prosperity, all were influenced, often profoundly, by the demands and disruptions of war. But understanding this isn't just an academic exercise. It teaches us something concrete. Economic systems don't evolve in a vacuum. They evolve in response to pressure, disruption, necessity, and human choices in the aftermath of conflict. When we study the economic strengths of a nation today, whether it's industrial capacity, innovation ecosystems, or global financial influence, we're also looking at the remnants of how that nation responded to conflict, adapted to it, and rebuilt from it. This is why some nations emerged stronger after major wars. They rebuilt with institutions that supported broad participation. They invested in systems that spread value, and they embraced innovation rather than clinging to old privileges. And this is also why some nations struggled. They rebuilt systems that favored narrow elites. They failed to integrate the disruptions of war into productive change, and they lacked the capacity to turn destruction into sustainable renewal. Understanding the role of war in shaping modern economies isn't just history, it's insight into how societies respond to disruption, how value is created under pressure, and how resilience is built, not through stability alone, but through adaptation. If this opened your eyes to how conflict and economic evolution are interwoven, hit subscribe. History shows not just what happened, it shows what's possible when societies are forced to reinvent themselves and build something that lasts.